All aboard as we blast off into the yonder. Gene Roddenberry was a creep, or very creeper. And Gene Roddenberry was a pretended atheist who I think was actually Luciferian. In fact, he was not somebody who only cared about science and scientism, but actually Gene Roddenberry was interested in channeling and contacting the entities. Nanu, welcome as we cover Star Trek, the motion picture. The Rand Corporation actually consulted on Star Trek. Did you know that? The Rand Corporation is, of course, the premier think tank that was involved in the machinations of the Cold War. The Rand Corporation not only got the Cold War going and fostered it, but it utilized the Cold War to change America. It moved America from a production economy to a service economy. The Rand Corporation designed the automatic doors in Star Trek. The Rand Corporation was involved in all kinds of alterations of culture, and it was at the background, actually, behind Star Trek itself in terms of how to utilize pop culture to alter America. Now, as you know, at Jay's Analysis, I did my dissertation, I did my work, I did my book on how pop culture alters and changes society. And we cannot overlook one of the most important cultural artifacts of Americanism, of progressivism, and of scientism, namely the Star Trek series. I would cringe impressions of Commander Spock, and of James T. Kirk. I've done those many times. I will spare you. But I do have to point out that there were high-level scientific elites like Hal Puthoff, Andrea Puharich, these kinds of characters who were involved in channeling and in the esoteric. And they wanted to combine their esotericism with occultism. And actually, Gene Roddenberry was in the circles of these people. So don't buy into the mythological view, the propaganda view that, science and Gene Roddenberry and materialism and evolution, they're all just total rational positions. Actually, these are occultic positions. The origins of scientism are actually Renaissance Hermeticism. So there's kind of an outer coterie that we've talked about for a long time here at my site and in my work that pretends to be scientific, but actually at its core, I argue, is Luciferian. And there's no better example of that than Gene Roddenberry. So when you watch Star Trek, I remember when I was younger and it would come on TV and you would see Next Generation or something like that, you would think of it as something that's purely, quote, scientific. As you get older and as you learn more and you know about scientism, you realize that Star Trek is actually a form of social engineering that's not about science, but actually about scientism. And scientism, again, at its root is esoteric. It's mythological. It's Gnostic, ultimately. Now, in my TV show Hollywood Decoded, we actually covered an entire episode of Next Generation in one of the shows. And we went into great detail to show that that episode was totally Gnostic. But this Council of Nine, this group that Roddenberry was involved in, that's actually the root of how we know this. When we watch the episodes, we can actually see a lot of esoteric, a lot of occult, a lot of goofy Gnostic elements that are in multiple episodes, multiple movies, multiple films. And so ultimately the series is transhumanism. Star Trek, of course, is what precedes Star Wars, right? Star Wars, I think, maybe had it was better at capturing the imagination of Americans and of the youth. People in my generation grew up with Star Wars, but the boomer generation, their Star Wars was Star Trek. So I think that it's accurate to say that things like the moon, the way we perceive space, the way we perceive outer space and so forth, is actually far more determined by the pop culture and by fiction and science fiction than it is by any kind of actual scientific analyses. So actually Star Trek has had way more influence on how we view pop culture than science, NASA, etc. NASA actually is just, in my view, another version of Star Trek. I'm not saying that there aren't people who don't do, rocket work or whatever at NASA. There are. Certainly there are satellites, etc. But I don't think that that most people's conception of science and of space, etc., is formed through actual research. Obviously, it's formed through pop culture. And that's one of the things that we've highlighted as Jay's analysis and why we are so critical of scientism. So let's talk about the ethos of Star Trek, the realm, the universe of Star Trek, and how I think that ultimately it kind of is Luciferian, how it teaches Gnosticism. So we know that there's high level, you can actually trace this out, by the way. There's high level think tank consultation that went on with the Rand Corporation. This is actually at the Rand Corporation's own website. You can find where they talk about their involvement in Star Trek, the TV show, and then obviously to a degree in the movies as well. So you have the idea of the different alien races. These are kind of analogous to different people groups, right? Vulcans, Romulans, Spock. I mean, is Spock? I mean, this is like the Kohanim blessing, right? And then if you do like this is this, right? So is Spock supposed to be a certain tribe? Is Spock supposed to be Roman? I think there's some overlap. It's not really clear. But the different alien races kind of are analogous to the different human tribal groups, you could say. This is pretty common in fiction, science fiction, right? We see this with Game of Thrones. We see it with Lord of the Rings, right? Here's her photo. Here's her photo. Here's her photo. Why do the dwarves resemble a certain people group? Here's her photo. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew. Anyway, the Federation of Star Trek. This is like the United Nations, isn't it? Yes, it is. It's like globalism. Interesting. The Federation of Planets. The Federation is centered where? San Francisco. It's like Silicon Valley, isn't it? Yes. It's high tech. Silicon Valley is high tech. So we were already kind of getting the preparation of Silicon Valley and all that back even in the Star Trek series. The fact that the Federation is centered in the realm, the region of Silicon Valley. The Federation is all of the planets, all the peoples united under one generic, you could say human rights manifesto, but some kind of generic globalism manifesto. Is Spock autistic, by the way? I think maybe he is. But the picture that we have is glistening, space stations, glistening trams, glistening San Francisco. Doesn't really match up to the San Francisco that we actually see with homeless people, crackheads, needles, feces on the streets, right? That's the actual San Francisco. And the image that we're sold in the science fiction is always this sort of utopian international space station situation, which is just total propaganda. The crew of the Enterprise is exceedingly diverse, isn't it? Diversity before everyone else, right? Is this an appropriate Star Trek bang situation? I think so. I think my bangs are very Star Trek. The crew is diverse. I actually met Uhuru one time. I was at my friend does comics. I was with him at a comic convention, and I got to go meet Uhura. And Uhura is thick. A lot of people think she's not thick. She is thick with 3 C's. George Takei was there. I didn't really get to meet George Takei, but that's okay. I got everybody's seen the famous picture of me standing behind Q. Q is Gnostic, by the way. He's the Gnostic Demiurge. And I actually made faces at the Demiurge. So that's probably the most based thing that you could do in the nerd realm of Star Trek, the geek dimension of Star Trek. I did the most based thing. So I'm like the Satanist of the Star Trek dimension because I made faces at Q, who is the Gnostic Demiurge. But let's get back to the movie. So what I did was I wanted to do an analysis. I wasn't sure how to approach an analysis of Star Trek, because Star Trek is zillions of movies and TV shows, and there's just no way that you could do an analysis of all of Star Trek. So why not just pick the first motion picture? So we'll start there. Now, notice too that they all wear the commie jumpsuits. I have the closest thing that I could find to a Star Wars uniform, this jumpsuit type of thing here. Everybody's the same. Everybody has things in common. It's a socialist, communist utopia of sorts. I think that is what it's trying to present, and the Federation kind of goes around policing everyone else, right? And we saw in the new films, if you read any of my analyses of the J.J. Abrams installments, you saw that we see fake flags come up. We see the people groups that don't go along with the Federation are all rogue states, right? That all comes up. And it's always been this way, right? You can even find these kinds of elements in the original Star Trek series, all the way back to Kirk and Spock in the TV show, encountering the Demiurge, killing the deity, fake flags, right? All of these things are actually in the original series. And why is that? Again, because from the outset, this Star Trek series had high-level Pentagon consultation, as most of these science fiction series actually have. So in the movie, what we have is this sort of absence, right? James T. Kirk has left the Enterprise. He's not there. Spock's off on his planet doing his weird rituals. And the crew is being reassembled because of a threat of a giant cloud out in space. This cloud, interestingly, is given deity attributes. Now, I've seen this movie in the past, but I never really thought about it. What is this cloud in space? It's the glory cloud. It's the Shekinah. And again, there are many Kabbalistic elements in Star Trek. There's the Kohanim, right? And this actually, when you do like this, that is the pyramid eye. And Leonard Nimoy actually talks about that's where it came from. So there are these Kabbalistic Platonic elements that come up pretty often in Star Trek. So there's this cloud out in space, this godlike cloud that is the cloud like we see in the Old Testament where God appears and there's the cloud of darkness and there's lightning and so forth. And this entity out in space, we don't know what it is, but it's headed for Earth. We think it's going to destroy Earth. And as the crew goes out on their journey to encounter this cloud, to try to stop it from destroying Earth, they go through a lot of stages that are super trippy, man. It's like they're literally tripping balls. The crew goes through these different warp zones and blah, 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 blah. And they're literally seeing tracers. Now, I don't know if they intentionally wanted this to be like an acid trip, but I kind of think that it is. I kind of think Star Trek the Motion Picture, kind of like Kubrick's 2001, is a sort of initiation. It's an experience, but that's not just a mental journey, but it's actually very similar to 2001, and this is only a few years after 2001 comes out from Kubrick, right? So they had to try to match the special effects, the hallucinogenic trip stages that Bowman goes through. They had to try to match that with Spock and the crew and different characters going through these phases of entering into the inner core of this cloud out in space. So they get there after all of these phases and stages of these trips, seeing the tracers, encountering the entities, the luminous light being that's the probe of this thing. And the bald chick, who is a virgin, gets possessed by the entity. The cloud zaps her away. The cloud possesses her and sends her back as a probe. And she's got this dot thing on her throat chakra. Again, I'm not kidding. This is all straight out of Kabbalistic stuff. It's all Cabalism. And I didn't remember any of this from the movie. It's been years since I watched Star Trek the Motion Picture. But so what happens is that, and this is a spoiler alert. If you've never seen the movie, I'm going to spoil it for you. So this female virgin spirit is possessed by this cloud out in space, which is, turns out, a demiurge. It's an alien entity that has, in some way, noticed a probe. So the old Voyager probe, it's called V'ger throughout the film. Turns out, ages ago, when NASA sent out the Voyager probe, which is fake and gay, this probe went on for centuries out into space and was found by some alien civilization. And the aliens thought that this probe was their creator. So they've been on a search for God, and their cloud that they're traveling around in, and that they are seeking for, believe that they think that their creator is somewhere on Earth. Right? So they trace it back to Earth, and then they get to Earth and they can't find an answer, so they want to kill God. So Kirk decides that he can spank the temper tantrum deity here. And literally, that's what he says. He says he tells V'ger that he's not going to tell him why they sent the probe and why they created V'ger. So V'ger gets really mad and threatens to nuke Earth. So V'ger is taking on the attributes of the Demiurge, right? The evil, jealous creator god from Gnosticism who's ready to destroy Earth. He's an archon. He flies around in a giant ark. The ark is his chariot. He flies around in this cloud. It's quite literally all the imagery of the Old Testament deity, who is the real God, by the way. Spock says that this deity is like a kind of perfect, rational series of thought patterns, right? Literally, that's what Spock says about it. And Spock goes and does his like mind meld with this entity. And this is the most interesting part of the film, because as Spock travels deeper and deeper into the entity, the cloud, there's a giant hole that he flies into, which looks like that part of the human body. I'm not joking. He goes into, and he says, I have penetrated the orifice of the entity. And he flies deeper into the entity, and he goes through a matrix. He goes through a simulation. So it combines the matrix simulation element of 2001 that we've covered many times over with Bowman. Combines that with the Kabbalistic Gnostic ritual elements that we've seen in other films, as well as 2001. And we learn that this is a deus ex machina. It's a god from within the machine. And the entity that it possesses, the Persis Kambata character, who is the virgin who's taken the vow to virginity, now has to unite and become one with the creator. So there is a coitus magic component to this that comes to the fore. And we learned that after all this penetration goes on, that V'ger then has to unite with his creator. And it turns out that the rival to Kirk character, I forget the guy's name, he volunteers to join in the coitus. So V'ger, possessing the virgin, takes on the Pistis Sophia presentation, and then we have to have the Adam and Eve joining. So it's like an Adam Kadmon joining restoration ritual that goes on. By the way, I forgot to mention that V'ger also decided that he wanted to totally depopulate Earth of the carbon units. That's because he saw a lot of absolute units when he came to Earth, because Earth, unfortunately, nowadays is full of absolute units. And so he wanted to literally depopulate all of the carbon units. But as it turns out, Kirk is able to dissuade him. And so what we get is a transhumanism sex ritual at the end of the film. And the Persis Kambata character and the foil to Kirk literally transcend and go into the next phase of evolution. And that's what they say. This entity, through this union, achieves the next phase of evolution. So what we have here is transhumanism, coitus magic. That's literally what the entire Star Trek motion picture is about. Combining the elements of the Matrix, combining the elements of 2001 into another a Luciferian apotheosis narrative. That's what you get with Star Trek. I was kind of blown away because I didn't remember that that's actually what Star Trek the motion picture is about. So hopefully you enjoyed this analysis. If you did, please leave a like below. And maybe we'll investigate other Star Trek installments. I'm not a huge Star Trek fan, but I thought it has such a powerful impact as a series, as a franchise on American culture, Americanism, modernism, progressivism, transhumanism. It's been so powerful, it has to be analyzed, it has to be discussed. So we started with the motion picture. Maybe we'll look back at some of the old shows. I don't know. Depends on how well you guys like this analysis. But I assure you, if you go back and watch Star Trek the motion picture, you will see that I am correct. I couldn't believe that it was that esoteric, actually. It was that occultic. But thank you for watching. If you like this analysis, go to Jay's Analysis and get signed copies of my book, Esoteric Analysis, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. You can also subscribe to Jay's Analysis. Tell me your comments below. You'll notice if you go and watch them, maybe you'll see a lot of the things perhaps that I didn't see. So please enlighten me, fellow nerds out there, and share this analysis if you would, and subscribe to my channel. If you like this analysis, be sure to click subscribe and give me a thumbs up down below. Also, be sure to check out Jay's Analysis and definitely click the bell down below to be sure you get the updates.